might open up your Bibles to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we'll look there in just a moment, 1 Corinthians 11. I always appreciate the efforts song leaders make to pick songs out to go along with the lesson. I almost feel like after that song we can just sum up. That was excellent and well suited to what we'll be talking about this morning. We're continuing in the series of lessons on the subject of godly womanhood, if you will. And we went through a number of lessons on the idea of masculinity, manhood. What does God have to say about that? And we're trying to reach some similar understanding and conclusions about women. And certainly the world is no less confused on the subject of women than it is on the subject of men. And depending on the conversation, maybe more so. The difficulties abound because so much confusion has been introduced. There is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 7, and we will come back to this passage later in the lesson, it says that women are the glory of man. That's one of the key elements that I want to look at is what does that even mean? And how are we to interpret that? And what does that tell us about women? The question here, what are women for, might sound like an odd way to phrase things, but I think this is a difficulty that we struggle with when we start talking about purpose. It's one thing to figure out what God's rules for life are, but to figure out purpose, this is another step. And I think we struggle to answer this question about much of creation. I think when we look at, for instance, the end of the book of Job, so many people look at the end of Job and they think God is not answering the question. That here the objections that have been posed by Job and even some of his friends, and God is simply ignoring all of that and saying, I'm creator, and so none of that matters. Instead of going through and pointing in very detailed ways at all of creation. And I think his conclusion is, you've not paid enough attention to my creation. You've not learned the things about me from creation that you ought to have learned. And therefore, you're making accusations that are baseless, that are answered if you just look around. And so we struggle to know even what, a chicken is for. Or any other sort of animal that we look around and see, much less, and maybe much more to our sorrow, our own selves. What are we for? What is the reason God created us? That is the question we might ask anyone who builds something, who makes something. Why did you make that? And the person hopefully has a good reason and says, I made this in order to accomplish something, in order to perform functions and so forth. Well, that is what we're looking at in our lesson this morning. And so I want to begin here going back then to the book of Genesis, where we have just sung about God's creation of man and woman. And notice what I'm calling a fundamental difference, that God did not create man and woman for identical purposes, but that he has distinct purposes. Now, man as a whole has common purpose. There are common purposes between man and woman, and we might say like a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap in what men and women ought to be accomplishing, but there are distinctives. And those are clearly laid out from the beginning, and they continue throughout the rest of scriptures. In Genesis chapter 2 and in verse 18, of course, it says there, God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable to him. And so one of the first distinctives we find as we notice the distinction, let me just go ahead and say this. One of the distinctions is man is created. Pause, we have a little bit of time, and then woman is created. That right there shows a distinctive. But in that pause, in that time frame between creating man and woman, he gives us the reason. He takes that time to say, this is why I'm going to create the woman in this instance. It's to be a helper. Now, there's a lot of things written about this word helper. and a lot of them are aimed at sort of taking away the apparent sting of the word helper. So, for instance, if I take Rylant with me, we go to the hardware store, one of the things we hear is, "You got your little helper with you today?" Well, that's fine when he's 5. I imagine when he turns 18, he won't find that as endearing to hear from the lady behind the counter, "You got your little helper with you?" It's sort of a demoralizing way or a condescending way to refer. And so people have taken that and said, the wife feels like that. That's your little helper, as opposed to something closer to equality. And in order to kind of combat that demeaning kind of notion here, a lot of people have said, this word helper, this is the same word that God uses when he helps man. And it is. It is certainly that language. But what conclusions are you trying to draw there? That she is now in the position of God? And that she takes that position over man? Well, certainly not. Let me just say, as you go and you explore this definition, the word simply means to provide aid. It just means to help. And that help can come from lots of directions. You can have a little helper. You can have a helper who is a complete equal and partner. You can have a helper who is far above you in every measurable way. So it doesn't say anything about the nature of the relationship. It just says, I'm making her to help him. Over in Exodus chapter 18 and in verse 4, in Exodus chapter 18 and verse 4, we see this word coming out again. It says here that Moses named one of his sons Eliezer. Ezer is the word helper. Eli would refer to God here. Eliezer. For he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And so you can see that word playing out there, right? God has been my Ezer. This is where we sing the song. Here I raise my Ebenezer. There in a reference to 1 Samuel, this rock of help that they set up as a reminder of God's help to them. Over in Psalm 146 and verse 5, how blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is Yahweh, his God. In fact, I will say the most common usage or attachment of this word to somebody being a help, it is God being a help. And so I would say that so far as pointing to relationship, as pointing to hierarchies and so forth, this word says nothing about hierarchies. It simply says purpose. Why did you make woman? To help him. Well, what all does that mean? Well, not much so far. It just means that she's there to provide something that he needs. It's not good for him to be alone. I'm going to make someone who is not just companion, someone who helps him. And I believe helps him accomplish the things that God has set out for man to do in Genesis 1 and chapter 2. We've talked about those things, about exercising dominion, about keeping and tending the garden and so forth. So she is there to help him accomplish those things. Now, the next thing that I would note about that help is that it is unique. Continuing on down to verse 20 in Genesis chapter 2, it says, and the man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helper suitable to him. I think one of the things to note about the creation narrative there is that this is the only case, as far as we know, where God takes that time and makes that distinction between male and female. Like it just says that he created these other species, and it doesn't say he created all the male of those species, waited a little bit, and then came back and created the females. He waits, and in that waiting, in addition to telling us why he made woman, he doesn't just tell Adam why he's making woman, but I believe lets Adam see the need for woman. In other words, as he brings all of these other potential helps, and those animals could help certainly in performing the functions, in many of the functions that God wants him to. They can help tend and keep the garden, right? He can put them to use. But they are not suitable, right? They won't fulfill the task. And guess what else won't fill the task? Another man, right? That's not sufficient. It's not simply good enough for God to bring another man alongside, but that he brings woman alongside. And so she fulfills something that none of the other animals and not another man can fulfill. She has a unique role in helping him perform all the things that God, all the purposes God has put man on the earth to fulfill. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 2, in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15, there Paul, in writing about the roles of women and so forth, he says, she will be saved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctification with self-restraint. As you think about what Paul is saying here, a lot of people swoop in immediately to say, Paul's not saying you have to have children in order to be saved. Well, of course he's not, right? You don't have to have children. But I do think that what we have to do is admit a very obvious reality, that women biologically are created to have children. And not only created to have them, but to care for them. Right? And this says something about her place in creation, that she is fulfilling this. And not only is she fulfilling this, but this is sort of I think one of the highest and greatest accomplishments for women. Regardless of what the world has to say about having children, I think Paul sets it up here at the highest degree. I think God sets it up at the highest degree. And that we should respect, as Paul was mentioning in the song we sang, we should respect the design. We should look at creation. Even if we did not have the revelation of God's word, we should be able to look at women and have an idea as to what function they perform in relationships. Now, somebody might say, so you're reducing women to nothing more than having children. No, I am starting there as the place where they are most honored. Can women do more things? Yes, but they can't do better things. They can do much more than just having and caring for children. But I think the problem is we act like that is like sweeping up the floor, right? That's a mere a menial sort of thing. Can't women accomplish much greater things than having children? No, they can't. I think that what we need to do is recognize and appreciate the glory of a woman's role. Now, somebody will immediately say, but what about all the women who don't have children? So you're saying they can't accomplish great things. I'm not saying they can't accomplish great things. And I'm not saying that they can't be glory in whatever they do accomplish. I'm not saying they can't be appreciated in whatever they accomplish. But I am saying that we can recognize that while also saying here is a very unique and primary function that God has brought women into the world in order to perform. It's not all, but it is, I think, among the most glorious. Well, I think also that as we look at that creation, and we see that distinction, and we see Adam being called to recognize that distinction, we also recognize that distance, the creation of man and then the creation of woman, was meant to communicate something. So back again over in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 8, it says, therefore I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Down into verse 14, verse 13 rather. I don't know why I put verse 8. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. For it was Adam who was formed first and then Eve. So as he's making his argument and as he's drawing conclusions on his argument, he says, look at the creation. Here is the order of creation. And I think sometimes when people are trying to draw different conclusions, they say, look, just because man was made first, that doesn't mean he's any more, he has any different role, that these roles are interchangeable and so forth, and that there's no purpose in that. Paul says there is purpose in that. Paul says God is saying something when he created man first and he created woman second. And it's not first, second, like priority or competition or anything like that, but it is first, second from the standpoint of saying something about their roles and their function towards each other. And that there is even from the standpoint of hierarchy. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, as we mentioned earlier, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and there beginning in verse 7, he says, for a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. And so again, not just the order, but even the nature. So here God created man, and then out of man he brought woman. And he goes on then to say, therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of, in verse 9, for indeed man was not created for woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. And again, he doesn't create woman and say, I created man to come alongside her, but her to come alongside man. And there's implications to be drawn from that. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because the angels. Nevertheless, he says, in the Lord, neither woman is independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth in the woman, but all things originate from God. We don't want to get carried away with any of this. And we do recognize that even though in that very original moment, woman comes from man, in every day since then, man has come from woman, right? That's the rest of the story of creation. But don't walk away from that first moment of creation. Like, these relationships matter. The direction of these relationships matter. And they have implications about the roles. We're not going to explore all of those implications in this lesson, but we just want to recognize this is not random. This is not God just saying, well, I just flipped a coin and man showed up first. No, there's purpose all along the way. Well, let's continue there in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 7 with that idea of glory. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 7. When it says that he, man, is the glory of God, and the woman is the glory of man. Here in 1 Corinthians 11, we have a question of submission. Submission to authority, right? That's the conversation. Whatever you think about the head covering, it is a conversation about authority. And in dealing with that authority, he is giving the whole picture from God to woman, and here's that picture. And man has authority in general terms over woman. And the way he communicates this in this instance is he's the glory of God, she's the glory of man. What do we mean by that? Well, over in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, Matthew 5 and verse 17, the passage here that I am actually looking for is verse 16. 5 and verse 16, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Connect this, if you will, back to Genesis chapter 45 and verse 13. Genesis chapter 45 and verse 13. This is where Joseph is sending his brothers back to retrieve his father. And he says, you must tell my father of all my glory in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. So let's start with Joseph here, and then we'll come back to Matthew 5:16. Joseph is telling his brothers, tell him about all of this stuff, my position, everything that shows my glory. So they're not going to go back and tell about how old Joseph is. They're not going to describe Joseph himself. They're going to describe the things that surround Joseph that show and prove that Joseph is in a place of glory. So glory in these instances, I think, is the thing that you point to that makes people more impressed with who you are, right? The glory's over there, but that points in this direction. So Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, when we are doing what we ought to, we are God's glory. That is that when people see us, God is more glorified. And so if people say, what makes God so great? We ought to be the sorts of people he can point to make his point. I think Job ends up being that, right? Job is a very good example of that here, Satan is questioning God, and God is able to point to Job and say, right here's my case. That Job glorifies God throughout that story and in the final verdict of that story. So, coming back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 7, we are hopefully glorifying our Father, that we are the glory of God. And women, and I particularly think that women in roles, in those traditional roles of wife or daughter, that they glorify the head of the house, right? The man of the house. I think first, Proverbs chapter 31 illustrates this, right? That's the picture, is that she is the one that her husband can point to that brings him glory. Why is he able to sit in the gates? Point right over there. Look at her. Look at what she brings to the table. Look at what she makes of him. Now, a lot of people might read that and hear that and think, well, this is terrible. So she's subservient. This is one of the words I heard most often when studying about women and looking at commentaries. And every commentary on every passage about women is quick to say, this is not in a subservient way. This is not in a subservient way. And I was like, are they using that differently than I am? So I go look up the word subservient, and it means to put the cares and concerns of others above yourself, to serve them better than yourself. And I thought, I don't know. I mean, it seems like it is in a subservient way. But nevertheless, I think they might add to that groveling and sort of sniveling aspects of that. But nevertheless, if someone says, what a shame that she must take that back seat, first of all, Proverbs chapter 31 doesn't look like she's unknown. I think she's being pointed to. But she must take that back seat, and her glory must point to him as opposed to her own glory. Can I suggest to you that when you have a woman whose glory is seen when her husband's is not, is an ugly picture? So, 1 Samuel chapter 25. You remember the story there of Abigail and Nabal? And you remember that Abigail, we remember Abigail as a glory, a better glory than her husband deserved. And so here she is being a glory. She is defending the home and her husband, who is a fool. And so somebody says, well, so my glory has to go in the direction of him. What if I want my own glory? I don't think you do. Because what that usually means is that it is in contrast with your husband, that he is not doing his job. Your help is not appreciated. And so a husband whose wife is outshining him is because he is a fool. Do you want to be in that relationship where you have glory and he does not? Do you want to have it in that competitive sense? I don't think Abigail wanted that. I think she got it. I think a lot of women today do want that. They do want a Nabal as a husband. And certainly culture presents all husbands as Nabals and wives as Abigails. But Abigail is in a miserable relationship in that circumstance. Well, continuing on then, I want to talk about the differences between preferences and patterns. So here we've talked about purpose. Why has God made women? I want to talk about the pattern that God has a distinct pattern in mind for creating women. And I want to say right off the bat that we certainly want to leave room for exceptions. Whatever else I'm going to say, I'm not saying that as we talk about the patterns that there is a singular rigidity to that pattern, that there are lots of exceptions that you might think of along the way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, what we have here is an exception. The pattern is for men and women to be married. But the exception in verse 26 is that Paul thinks it's good because of the present distress that a man should remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. If you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. God did not make marriage to make trouble. And Paul is not trying to help these people avoid what God created for them. There are other reasons, there are exceptional reasons in Corinth that make the thing that is, as a rule, good, in their case, trouble, or at least potential trouble. And so we recognize that. Somebody says, look, I appreciate all these patterns, but there are reasons in my life that I was not able, for whatever reason or reasons, to fulfill those patterns. Understood. And we may need to talk about what are good reasons and what are not good reasons for running away from that pattern. Or, in fact, we never want to run away from that pattern. But we'll talk more about those things as we go along. I just want to set that in place. We do, however, want to appreciate the ideal. We want to proclaim it as the ideal, hold it up as the ideal, and we don't want to, in our making room for the exceptions, we don't want to tear down the notion that there is an ideal. This is where our society is in so many instances, is they've moved from saying, yes, I know that's the ideal, but it's not for everybody, over to there is no ideal. Like it's all the same. Nothing is better than anything else. Everybody's just different. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and beginning verse 9, it says, a widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works. She has brought up children. If she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in affliction, if she has devoted herself to every good work. We don't run up against this passage very much because we, for various reasons, I think, have produced more independence in our society and so forth. And so we rarely find widows falling destitute upon the care of the church. Fair enough. But I think that if we were falling up against it, the modern mindset would be how very bigoted. That Paul would say you can only fall into this category if you've been married and you've brought up children and you've done all of these other things. That here is this woman. What are you saying that women who haven't done these things don't have needs? Well, surely they do. And incidentally, I do think that we can help women who aren't in these patterns who have needs. I think this is talking about an ongoing support. So I don't just toss those to the side. But I think what Paul is doing is categorically saying, if she has fully inhabited that pattern. And I think one thing to note about that is that if she has, this is an unlikely scenario. Because what's most likely? Well, she's probably got kids to take care of her. She's probably got family of varying levels that she can lean upon. But for whatever reason, there are some who have lost their husbands, they've lost their children, and now they become wards of the church. But only if the ideal has been present. What about those who haven't lived the ideal? It's less than ideal. I think the same thing when we're talking about elders, right? We're painting a picture of elders. What about all the members who don't fit those qualifications? Well, we still want to have you as members. We want to be part of the church and so forth. But that's not the people we want to lead the church. We want an ideal picture to lead. And so there is an ideal picture of the life of a woman. Somebody says, so because my life has been less than ideal, I'm not a woman. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that no matter who you are and what your life looks like, you ought to love the ideal even if you're not able, for some reason, to live that out. Simone de Beauvoir, who is as pretentious as her name sounds, says no woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not even have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make it. This is not a woman who is saying that, look, if that's what you want to do. No, she says that's the problem. Too many women do want to do it. And incidentally, I think they do because of creation. I think that's part of who they are made to be. And no matter how much education to the contrary you give them, women continue to drift back towards that creation model. And a more flippant and modern attitude towards kids. I can't remember the name. I forgot to put it down. Some fashion designer says, no one wants kids anymore. I don't like children at all. They're noisy. They smell. They're expensive. That's a shallow and self-absorbed way to look at children, but isn't that where we are? Is that people look at children and all they see is the burden, and therefore all they see is the opposite of the blessing that God intends them to be. You do not have to have children to please God, but you cannot hate them and please God. You don't have to be married to please God, but you cannot hate marriage and please God. And so even those people who do not inhabit all of these ideals need to look around and appreciate those who do and understand that that is the normal pattern that God has put in place. Along these lines, we don't want to develop an animosity towards what I will call here gender norms. We mentioned this as we were talking about men's roles. In Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 25 is this occasionally referenced passage about men's and women's clothing. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to Yahweh your God. I don't bring that up as an edict, but rather as a recognition that all throughout history and all cultures, God and men have had an expectation that people know what women look like, know how they present themselves, and they know how men present themselves. And God could even have an expectation with a rule that says, don't do this, with no other description than to say, don't dress like the opposite sex. And a lot of smart alecks today will go, what do you mean by that? You know what I mean by that. So for instance, as we talk about what we mean by that, it could bring in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 where Paul is appealing to the hairstyles that are fairly universally natural. And I'm not getting into what the length is. I am saying this, that in every society, you know how men typically keep their hair, and you know how women typically keep their hair. And here's the point I would make from all of that, that if people want to pretend that they don't know those things, then I would offer this. If I gave you $1 million to draw a picture of a little girl, and I told you that 100 out of 100 people had to be able to identify that as a little girl, what would you do? What would you draw? What would her hair look like? What would her clothes look like? You would know how to draw that, and you would know what to make that little girl look like, to present that little girl. And you wouldn't say silly things like, well, little girls can wear these things too. Yeah, but if you wanted to make sure you were communicating a certain picture because you wanted to win $1 million, guess what? All the confusion would vanish. And you would know exactly how to present that. And so all we need is a little motivation, right? In order to be able to understand the distinctions between men and women. And I do not say that you have to embrace at every moment and every time the most feminine picture that is possible. I do simply say this: we should not look down on a feminine presentation. And we should not mock a feminine presentation. And we should not certainly embrace the notion that I'm going to run as far away from that as possible. It is one thing for a little girl to be interested in things that are not classically feminine. It is another thing to then say, I am going to dive into that and make that my identity. And I think that's what's happened. Is we've gone from, there's some room for preference here, to, hey, I'm going to make sure that nothing I prefer looks like a little girl. That's a problem. Wes Brown, back in 2019, when he was here, he talked about the advertising that goes on in toy companies and even news articles and so forth that were saying, stop buying little girls' dolls and buy them a chemistry set. Well, now look, I don't care if my daughter has a chemistry set, but I want her to have little dolls, right? I want to make sure she wants to be a little girl. And if as a little girl she's also interested in chemistry, that's fine. But my point is that what the world has done is said, no, let's do everything we can to subvert this. Let's push in the opposite direction. And that is certainly something we cannot participate in. I even want to suggest this, that the adornment of women. Some people will go to a passage like 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter says your adornment is not merely external, braiding hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on garments. Let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible quality of a lowly and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. And I say, see, women who get caught up in the way they look on the external are frivolous and so forth, and then that gets associated in all negative terms. I don't think that's what Peter is saying. I do think, obviously, that Peter is saying you can get carried away with this, and I don't want you to get carried away with this. I want you to focus on inner first. But I think what he's actually saying is I want the outer to be an accurate reflection of the inner. It's not make no efforts about your appearance, look like a total slob, but be a good person on the inside, right? It's don't let the external focus overwhelm the internal focus. God himself in Ezekiel chapter 16, when he is describing his relationship to Israel, who is presented as a daughter, he says, I clothed you, this is Ezekiel 16 and verse 10, I clothed you with embroidered cloth, put sandals of porpoise skin on your feet. I wrapped you with fine linen and covered you with silk. I also adorned you with ornaments and put bracelets on your hand and a necklace around your neck. I also put a ring in your nose, earrings in your ears, and a splendid crown on your head. Thus you were adorned with gold and silver, and your clothing was of fine linen, silk, embroidered cloth. You ate fine flour, honey, and oil, so you were exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty. And so as he talks about his relationship with Israel, and I know this is figurative, but he's using the imagery of, I made you beautiful. And I think what you see is a consistent picture throughout Scripture that women and beauty and making themselves beautiful is a consistent pattern throughout Scripture. And so while I don't mean you have to be the girliest of girly girls, don't mock women who fall into the very patterns that God created in society. And I mean, heed the warnings of Peter, absolutely. but don't make a mockery of the distinctions. Well, I just want to leave with this note, that exceptions are not endorsements. I think one of the big difficulties in all of this is what we do is we find exceptions to the rule, and then we say, if there's an exception to the rules about patterns and preferences and so forth, if at any moment we find a woman who is acting outside of those patterns, then what we have is a new pattern. No, what we have is an exception. In history, this is what, even without the scriptures, people, talk about military endeavors and so forth, and the masculine nature of military. And somebody says, have you ever heard of Joan of Arc? Yes. Is it not striking to you that that's literally the only name you could come up with? Right? That's not a pattern. That's an exception to the pattern. And so, when we start talking about the roles of women, inevitably, the subject of Deborah is going to be brought up. And instead of looking and seeing right within the story of Deborah how the exceptions stand out, not just that she's a woman, but the things that go along with that, they just ignore all of that and say, judge, leader of Israel, military leader, all those things are true about Deborah, therefore those distinctions don't matter. They're not true. And yet, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. You don't know who the wives of the various judges are. Maybe one. But you get the husband here of Deborah. She is the wife of Lapidoth. Not only that, she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. There's a distinction between what Deborah's doing here. She is not asserting herself onto Israel, but rather Israel's coming to her. And that bears out in the story because Barak comes to her and he says, I want you to go with me. And essentially she shames him. And again, shows the exception. This should not be. Why is a man coming and asking for a woman to go into battle with him? This is shameful. That shame comes out in the song in the next chapter. I would add to that over in Isaiah chapter 3 and in verse 12. In Isaiah chapter 3 and in verse 12, Isaiah says, O my people, their taskmasters are infants, and women rule over them. I'll tell you what, you read that passage to people today, they would say, well, then they've arrived. That's not what he means, is it? Here's a miserable thing. The children and the women are in charge. Now, if you think what I mean by that is that there are no women who could do a good job leading, you're wrong. It's just that when women are required to stand in that position, it means something has failed miserably. I think that's Judges. Israel had failed miserably. I think Deborah's a noble person who is being thrust into a position she should not have to be thrust into. I think that's what she's communicating to Barak. And I think right here he's saying, shame on you. None of you men have risen up to lead, and therefore you've left it to be ruled by children and to be ruled by your wives. It should not be. And I can't tell you how many people just brush right past. I've had these conversations, had it not too long ago, talking about women in leadership and so forth, and I bring this up, and they go, well, now look, I'm just not sure what's going on there. I'm like, you're trying pretty hard not to be sure about what's going on there. I think it seems pretty clear what's going on there. Now, to the point about preferences and patterns. It is, I think sometimes people acknowledge these truths about women. And then what they do is they put all of these truths into the category of preferences. And they make it so that there's nothing left to be said about God or women on these matters. I was listening to a guy do some talks recently, and he was talking about the design. God created us, purpose of design, and so forth. And he was talking about how in seminary, wherever he was in seminary, that they spent so much time focusing on design, that there was a designer, they were dealing with intelligent design and so forth. And he had a fellow seminary student, and his wife had just given birth to a child, and they said, times are really tough because formula is so expensive. And he looked at him and he said, there's another way to feed your kid. And at that time, formula was all the rage. Everybody was just moving. We were told by the society it's even healthier, right? It's even better for your kids because it's formulated by the scientists, and they know how to formulate that. Instead of stepping back and go, wait a minute. God has, in his design, provided for this very thing. And the hubris of men to come in. Now, you might say, well, there's times when formula is needed. Granted. But to say it's better than God's design? To say men have figured out better how to provide for the baby that came from this mother than God who made that happen? That is where I get off the train. I don't, and if you think I'm standing up here telling you have to breastfeed your children and that I'm taking that decision away, that's not my point. My point is the things that we think and say about those things matter. And when we start saying that men have somehow figured out how to escape God's design or worse yet, do better than God's design, that's blasphemous. And we need to step back and recognize God created all these things. And he knows better about all those things than we do. It's not enough to simply combat Simone de Beauvoir, where she says no women should be authorized, to come in and say, look, it should be okay for women to stay at home. It certainly should be okay for women to be homemakers. But we must rather proclaim with God that this is good along with all of creation. We must say more than simply it is acceptable. Part of learning to serve God is learning to trust that he knows better than I do. One of the most effective things I've heard on homosexuality and gender confusion and so forth, and dealing with people who do believe in God, is a woman, or a couple of women that I've heard having those conversations. And one of the things that they ask these people is, do you believe God made you? Yes. Do you trust him more than you trust your feelings? Yes. Well, if God says that here is how men and women can be happy, why aren't you willing to trust that more than your feelings, what they say about how you could be happy? And I think as we contemplate these ideas in our homes, in our own lives, that we need to be thinking in terms not just of my independent preference that says, well, look, I like this thing over here. That may be suitable, that may be acceptable, but we need to be very careful that our foundation is not, I'm going to do this because it is my preference. Our foundation needs to be, how can I please God? How can I be most pleasing to God? How can I come fully, as much as possible, into what God wants me to be? My goal is that, to be what he wants me to be, and to want that more than what I want me to be. If there's someone here this morning who would want that, who would be willing to surrender at that level and say, look, this is the path my life has been going, but I want to back up and I want to see what his pattern is, and I want to fall in line with that, whatever that is. Then we would urge you, if there's any way that we can help you, bring your life into accordance with him. If you'll make that known, you can do so while we stand and while we sing.